You paid for the tuition not because you're family but because you could afford it, my daughter-in-law said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, and in that moment, surrounded by applause and champagne glasses, I realized I had never truly belonged at that table. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to the polite laughter that followed as if it were a harmless joke, as if I were just another guest instead of the woman who had quietly written every check that made this celebration possible. The graduation hall was bright, filled with proud families taking pictures and hugging their children, but somehow I felt like I was fading into the background, like a figure in someone else's story. My grandson Ethan stood just a few feet away, smiling for photos, his cap tilted slightly, his future wide open, and I remembered the day I sold my last car to make sure he could stay in school. The day I told myself that family meant sacrifice, that love meant showing up even when no one asked you to. I smiled back at him now, the same gentle smile I had practiced for years, the kind that hides more than it reveals. Rachel adjusted her designer coat and leaned into Daniel, whispering something that made him nod without looking at me. And that was when I understood something had shifted long before this moment, something I had refused to see. For years, I told myself their distance was just life getting busy, that young families needed space, that my role was to support, not to question. I remembered the late-night phone calls from the financial office, the emails about tuition deadlines, the quiet relief in Ethan's voice when I told him not to worry, that Grandma would take care of it. I never asked for recognition. I never needed a thank you. But I had believed, perhaps foolishly, that love would be enough to keep me inside the circle. Instead, I was standing just outside it, looking in. The applause swelled again as another name was called, and I realized Rachel was watching me, not with warmth, but with something colder, something calculated. She smiled when our eyes met, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and said, "We just want what's best for Ethan's future." As if that explained everything. As if that justified the quiet way they had begun to rearrange their lives without me in it. I nodded because that's what I had always done. I nodded and stayed quiet, and for a long time that had worked in their favor. But something about the way she said it, the certainty in her voice, the assumption that I would simply accept my place, made a small steady thought take root in my mind. I had been useful. I had been generous. But I had never been seen. And as the ceremony ended and families gathered for photos, I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching them celebrate, watching Daniel put his arm around Rachel while Ethan laughed at something on his phone, and I realized that the story they were telling did not include me, not really. I turned slowly, stepping away from the crowd, my heels echoing softly against the polished floor. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel sad. I felt clear. Because if I wasn't family, then perhaps it was time I stopped acting like I was. I drove home in silence that afternoon, the kind of silence that does not come from peace, but from something settling deep inside your chest, something final. The road was familiar, the same turns I had taken for over 30 years, but everything looked slightly different, like I was seeing it without the filter I had been living behind. When I pulled into my driveway, the house greeted me the way it always had, still and patient, as if it had been waiting for me to come back and notice what had been right in front of me all along. I set my keys down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet, and for the first time in a long while it did not feel lonely. It felt honest. I poured myself a cup of coffee even though it was already late in the afternoon, wrapping my hands around the mug as if I needed something solid to hold on to, and my mind began to replay the years I had so carefully justified. It had not started all at once. It never does. First it was small things. A missed Sunday dinner here, a last-minute cancellation there. Rachel would apologize with that same practice tone, explaining how Ethan had a study group or how Daniel was overwhelmed at work. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. Then the visits became shorter, the conversations more distant. I remember one Thanksgiving when I brought my homemade pies and Rachel smiled politely before setting them aside, replacing them with something she had ordered from a bakery, something that looked perfect but tasted like nothing. I told myself times were changing. I told myself I needed to adapt. But the truth was simpler than that. I was being moved out of the center of their lives one small step at a time. I walked into the living room and noticed the photo on the shelf, the one from Ethan's high school graduation. I had been standing at the edge of that picture too, just barely in the frame, smiling like I belonged there, and I wondered how many times I had quietly stepped aside so they could take up more space. I sat down and opened the drawer where I kept my old checkbook, the pages worn from years of use, and I traced my fingers over the numbers I had written: tuition payments, textbooks, housing fees, all of it carefully accounted for, all of it given without hesitation. I never kept score. I never thought I needed to, but now I could see it clearly. To them it had never been love. It had been convenience. I remembered a conversation from a few months ago, one I had dismissed at the time. Rachel had been talking to a friend on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice lowered but not enough. She said, "As long as she keeps helping, there is no reason to make things complicated." I had paused in the hallway, pretending not to hear, telling myself I must have misunderstood. But I had not misunderstood. I had simply chosen not to see. I set the checkbook back in the drawer and closed it gently, as if that small action marked the end of something much larger. The sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the room, and I realized that for years I had been measuring my place in their lives by how much I could give, by how useful I could be, and I had never stopped to ask what remained when I gave nothing at all. I took a slow breath and looked around my home, at the walls that held decades of memories, at the furniture I had chosen, at the quiet that now felt like clarity instead of absence, and a single thought settled firmly in my mind. If they had built their world on what I provided, then it was time to see what their world looked like without it. The next morning I did not wake up feeling angry. I woke up early, before the sun had fully risen, and sat at my kitchen table with a notebook I had not used in years. The house was quiet in that familiar way, but now every small sound felt sharper, clearer, as if I were finally paying attention. I wrote one simple sentence at the top of the page. What have I been giving and what have I been receiving? I stared at it for a long time before I began to answer. The giving part was easy. Tuition. Rent support during Ethan's freshman year. Medical bills when Daniel said they were struggling. Birthday gifts that were never small, never thoughtless. I had always believed that generosity should feel natural, not measured, but now the list grew longer and longer, and I realized I had never once asked where the line was. The receiving part was different. I paused after writing the word, my pen hovering above the paper, and what came to mind were not actions but absences. Missed invitations. Shortened phone calls. Conversations that ended just when I began to feel included. I closed the notebook slowly and leaned back in my chair, letting the realization settle without rushing to soften it. Later that afternoon my phone rang. Daniel. His name lit up the screen and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I answered anyway. His voice sounded casual, almost rehearsed. He asked how I got home, if everything was fine, as if yesterday had been just another day. I told him I was fine. I kept my voice steady, neutral, the way I had learned to do over the years. There was a pause, and then he cleared his throat and said they were planning a small celebration dinner next week, something more intimate, just close family, and that I should come. The word should stayed with me. Not want. Not hope. Just should. I asked him who would be there, and he listed names that did not surprise me. Rachel's parents. A couple of their friends. Ethan, of course. I waited to hear something else, something that might sound like inclusion, but it did not come. Instead, he added that it would be easier if I did not bring anything this time, that everything was already taken care of. I almost smiled at that. For years, I had been the one taking care of everything. Now suddenly, I was being asked to simply show up, empty-handed, as if my role had quietly shifted from provider to placeholder. After I hung up, I stood by the window and watched a neighbor walk her dog down the street. A small, ordinary moment that felt grounding in its simplicity. I thought about that dinner, about the way Rachel would arrange the table, about how conversations would flow around me instead of with me, and I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. They were not asking me to be part of their life. They were asking me to fit into the space they had already decided I should occupy. That evening, I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. The numbers on the screen were familiar. The savings I had built carefully over decades, the funds I had always considered a safety net for my family. I looked at the recurring payments scheduled for the next semester, the tuition installment that would be processed in just a few weeks, and I hovered over it for a long time. My finger did not move right away. Instead, I thought about Ethan, about his smile, about the life ahead of him, and I felt a quiet sadness that had nothing to do with money. But then I remembered Rachel's voice, calm and certain, and Daniel's silence beside her, and something inside me settled into place. I did not feel angry. I did not feel rushed. I simply understood that this decision was no longer about generosity. It was about truth. And truth, once you see it clearly, does not ask for permission. That night, I did not cancel the payment right away. And that was not hesitation, it was intention. I had learned something over the years that no one ever teaches you directly, that the most important decisions are not the ones you rush through, but the ones you understand completely before you act. I closed my laptop and sat there in the dim light of the kitchen, letting the silence stretch, letting every memory come forward without trying to soften it or push it away. I remembered Daniel as a boy, the way he used to run into the house after school, dropping his backpack by the door and calling out for me as if I were the center of his world. I remembered the nights I stayed up helping him with homework, the weekends spent at soccer games, the quiet promise I made to myself that I would always be there for him, no matter what life looked like when he grew up. And I had kept that promise, even when it meant working longer hours, even when it meant giving up things I never told anyone about. I had been there, consistently, without condition. Somewhere along the way, that consistency had been redefined, not as love but as expectation. I stood up and walked slowly through the house, touching the back of a chair, straightening a picture frame, small motions that felt grounding in a way I had not noticed before. In the hallway, I paused at the mirror and looked at myself, really looked, not as a mother, not as a provider, but as a person who had lived a full life and deserved to be seen clearly. There was nothing fragile about the woman staring back at me. There was nothing disposable either. The next morning, I made a phone call I had been putting off for years. Not to Daniel, not to Rachel, but to someone who knew me before I became everything for everyone else. Her name was Carol, and we had worked together decades ago, before retirement, before family responsibilities had taken over every corner of my time. When she answered, her voice carried the same warmth I remembered, and for a moment, I felt something loosen in my chest. We spoke for nearly an hour, not about money or obligations, but about life, about the years that had passed, about the things we had both quietly set aside. She laughed when I told her I still made the same apple pie, and she said she would come over soon and remind me what it felt like to cook for someone who simply enjoyed being there. After I hung up, I realized how long it had been since I had allowed myself to exist outside the role I had been playing. That afternoon, I opened my laptop again and reviewed the payment schedule one more time. Not with doubt, but with clarity. The numbers were the same, the account details unchanged, but my understanding of them had shifted completely. This was not support anymore. It was leverage. Not theirs. Mine. I clicked into the settings and removed the automatic transfer, replacing it with a manual option that required my direct approval. It was a small change, quiet, almost invisible, but it marked a boundary I had never drawn before. I did not send a message. I did not explain. I simply closed the laptop and let the decision stand on its own. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Rachel, short and to the point, asking if I had received the updated tuition invoice for the next semester. I read it once, then again, noting the tone, the absence of any personal warmth, the assumption that I would respond the way I always had. I set the phone down without replying. Not out of anger, but because for the first time I understood that silence could mean something different. Could mean I was thinking. Could mean I was choosing. And as the evening settled into night, I sat by the window once more, watching the lights flicker on in the houses across the street, and I felt something unfamiliar but steady take hold. Not resentment. Not regret. Just the quiet beginning of a line that I would no longer allow anyone else to move. The following day I kept my routine exactly the same, and that was deliberate. I woke up at the same hour, made my coffee the same way, and sat by the same window where the morning light slowly filled the room, but inside, something had shifted into place with quiet precision. Around mid-morning my phone rang again, and this time I already knew who it would be before I looked at the screen. Rachel. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, not out of avoidance, but because I wanted to answer on my terms, not hers. When I finally picked up, her voice came through smooth and controlled, but there was a slight edge beneath it that had not been there before. She asked if everything was all right, if I had seen her message about the tuition, and whether there had been any issue with the payment going through. I told her everything was fine, my tone calm, almost gentle, and for a moment there was silence on the line, as if she was trying to understand what that meant. She pressed again, this time more directly, mentioning deadlines, administrative holds, the kind of details meant to create urgency, but I did not rush to fill the space. I simply said I would take care of it when I was ready. The conversation ended shortly after that, not with tension, but with something more subtle, something unresolved. I could almost hear the shift in her thinking, the recalculation. By the afternoon, Daniel called. His voice carried a different weight, less casual than the day before, more careful. He did not ask how I was. He went straight to the point, asking if there had been a problem with the tuition payment. I told him there had not been a problem, just a change, and he paused long enough for me to picture him standing somewhere, phone in hand, trying to decide how to respond. He said Ethan was counting on things staying on track, that this was important for his future, and I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him a simple question. When was the last time you asked me what I needed? The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was not confusion. It was recognition, even if he did not want to admit it. He tried to shift the conversation back, talking about responsibilities, about family expectations, but the words sounded practiced, like something he had said before without thinking. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply repeated that I would handle things in my own time. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, not feeling victorious, not feeling hurt, just aware. For the first time, they were not certain of me. That certainty had been their foundation, the quiet assumption that I would always respond the same way, always give, always step forward before being asked. Without that certainty, they were unsettled. That evening, I took out the notebook again and wrote a new sentence beneath the first one. What happens when I stop being predictable? I did not answer it right away. Instead, I let the question sit there, open, unfinished, because I was beginning to understand that the answer would not come from them. It would come from me, one decision at a time. And somewhere between those quiet moments and those measured responses, I realized something else. I was no longer reacting to their expectations. I was observing them. And people reveal far more when they believe they are still in control. The next few days unfolded with a kind of quiet tension that no one acknowledged directly, but everyone could feel. I did not reach out again, and neither did I rush to respond when messages came in, and that alone seemed to create a shift I could almost measure. By the third day, Rachel's tone had changed entirely. The next message was longer, more detailed, filled with information about deadlines, late fees, administrative consequences, each sentence carefully constructed to sound reasonable, while carrying an undercurrent of urgency. I read it slowly, noting how there was still no mention of me beyond what I could provide, no question about how I was, no acknowledgement of the conversation we had not finished. I set the phone down and went about my day, letting the silence do its work. Later that afternoon, I drove to the bank, not because there was anything urgent to resolve, but because I wanted to see things clearly in person without distraction. The building was familiar, the same place I had visited for years, but walking through those doors felt different now, as if I were stepping into a space where I could finally separate what belonged to me from what I had been giving away without thought. I sat across from the bank manager, a polite woman who recognized me immediately, and as she pulled up my accounts on her screen, I realized how rarely I had looked at these numbers with my own future in mind. She explained everything carefully, balances, transfers, scheduled payments, and I listened without interruption, asking questions I should have asked long ago. What would my savings look like in 5 years if nothing changed? What would happen if I reduced my outgoing commitments? What options existed that I had never considered because I had always assumed my role was fixed? The answers were simple, but they carried weight. I had more control than I had allowed myself to believe. When I left the bank, I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt steady. That evening, Daniel called again, and this time there was no attempt at casual conversation. His voice carried frustration now, a thin layer of impatience that he was trying to keep in check. He said the school had flagged the account, that they needed confirmation, that delays could create complications for Ethan. I listened, letting him finish, and when he paused, I spoke slowly, choosing each word without emotion. I told him I was reviewing my finances and making adjustments, that I needed time to consider how I would move forward. He did not like that answer. I could hear it in the way he exhaled, in the way his tone sharpened just slightly as he reminded me of everything that was at stake. For a moment I said nothing, and in that silence, I could hear something else beneath his words, Not concern, not even anger, but expectation being challenged for the first time. When I finally responded, I asked him another simple question. If I stopped paying, what would you do? He did not answer right away, and that told me more than anything he could have said. After we hung up, I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the last bit of daylight fade through the windows, and I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. They had never planned for a moment where I would step back. There was no alternative in their thinking, no adjustment, no contingency, just assumption. And now that assumption was beginning to crack. I picked up my notebook again and wrote a second line beneath the last. They do not know who I am without their expectations. I closed it gently and placed it on the table, not as a reminder but as a marker. Because whatever came next would not be driven by habit or guilt or the need to be needed. It would be driven by choice. And choice, once you claim it, changes everything. By the end of the week, the silence I had chosen was no longer being ignored, it was being challenged. Rachel showed up at my door without calling, something she had not done in years, and that alone told me everything had shifted more than they were willing to admit. I opened the door calmly, as if this were any ordinary visit, and she stood there with a polite smile that felt carefully placed, like something she had practiced in the car before walking up. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, her eyes moving quickly around the room, taking in the familiar space as if it were suddenly unfamiliar to her, as if she were trying to understand what had changed without anything actually looking different. She began speaking almost immediately, her tone measured but edged with urgency, explaining how important it was to keep things stable for Ethan, how the school was expecting confirmation, how disruptions at this stage could create unnecessary complications. I listened without interrupting, letting her fill the room with words that sounded reasonable on the surface but carried something much sharper underneath. When she paused, I asked her to sit down, and for a brief moment she hesitated, as if she had not expected that kind of calm invitation. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same place where I had once written checks without thinking twice, and now the space felt different, not hostile, just clear. I asked her a simple question, one that did not require explanation, only honesty. If I stopped paying, what would happen? She did not answer right away. Instead, she shifted in her seat, her expression tightening just enough to reveal the strain beneath her composure. She spoke about responsibility, about family stepping up for one another, about how everyone had been counting on me, and I noticed how she never actually answered the question. She spoke in circles, building a case without ever acknowledging the foundation of it. I let her finish, and then I said quietly that I was no longer making decisions based on what others expected from me, but on what I understood for myself. The words were not loud, but they landed with a weight I could feel in the room. Her smile faded then, not dramatically, but enough to reveal something more direct, something less controlled. She asked if this was about what had been said at the graduation, if I was holding on to something that had been misunderstood. I met her gaze without hesitation and told her I had understood it perfectly. There was another pause, longer this time, and I could see her thinking, adjusting, searching for a different approach. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted entirely, softer on the surface but firmer underneath, as if she were trying to re-establish control without appearing to push. She reminded me of everything I had already done, as if that history created an obligation to continue, as if past generosity erased the right to choose differently now. I let the silence stretch again before responding, and when I did, my voice was steady, almost gentle. I told her that what I had done before was my choice, and what I would do next would also be my choice, and that those two things were not the same. She stood up then, the conversation clearly not going the way she had expected, and for the first time since I had known her, there was no polished response, no smooth conclusion. She simply said that Daniel would not understand this, that it would create problems, and I nodded, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. After she left, the house returned to its quiet, but it no longer felt like something I needed to fill. It felt like space I could finally stand in without adjusting myself to fit someone else's expectations. And in that space, I realized something with a certainty that did not waver. They were no longer asking. They were reacting. And that meant the balance had already begun to change. The next few days passed without another visit, but the quiet was no longer neutral, it carried weight, like something building just beneath the surface. I did not reach out, and that absence seemed to press against them more than anything I could have said. By Monday morning, I received a message from Daniel asking if we could all sit down together, just the three of us, to clear the air before things became more complicated. I read it once, then again, noting the shift in language, no longer assuming, no longer directing, but asking. I agreed, not because I felt obligated, but because I understood that this was the moment everything would either be said or left unsaid permanently. We chose Wednesday evening at their house, the same place I had spent years walking into with bags of groceries, desserts, and quiet support. This time I arrived empty-handed, just as he had suggested days earlier, but the difference was not what I carried, it was what I no longer did. Rachel opened the door, her expression composed but tighter than usual, and Daniel stood behind her, his posture rigid in a way that reminded me of when he was a boy trying to brace himself for something he did not want to hear. We sat in the living room, the same arrangement as always, but the air felt different, clearer, like the roles we had all been playing had finally been set aside. Daniel began speaking first, his voice controlled, explaining how important it was to keep things stable for Ethan, how this situation was creating unnecessary stress, how misunderstandings could escalate if we did not handle them carefully. Rachel nodded beside him, adding that they had always appreciated my support, that they had never intended for anything to feel disrespectful. I listened without interrupting, letting their words settle, noticing how carefully they avoided certain phrases, how they spoke around the issue without naming it directly. When they finished, the room fell quiet, and for a moment no one moved. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands together, and spoke in the same calm tone I had used all week. I told them I had heard everything they said, but that I needed them to hear something just as clearly. I told them that support is a choice, not an obligation, and that choice changes the moment respect disappears. Rachel shifted in her seat, her composure tightening, and Daniel looked at me as if trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the version he had always known. I continued, not raising my voice, not rushing my words, simply stating what had already become undeniable to me. I told them that I would not continue any financial support for the next semester, that I had made that decision carefully, and that it was final. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Rachel was the first to react, her voice sharper now, asking if I understood what that meant for Ethan, asking if I was willing to let his future be affected over what she called a misunderstanding. I met her gaze without hesitation and said quietly that I understood exactly what it meant, and that I had also understood what it meant when I was told I was not family. Daniel spoke then, his voice strained, asking why I had not said anything sooner, why I had let things reach this point. I held his gaze and told him that I had been saying something for years, just not with words he chose to hear. No one spoke after that. The room held a stillness that did not need to be filled. After a few moments, I stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with the quiet certainty of someone who had already finished what needed to be said. I told them I hoped Ethan would find his way forward, that I believed he would, and that my decision was not about punishment, it was about truth. Rachel did not respond. Daniel did not stop me. And as I walked out of that house, closing the door gently behind me, I realized something with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. I had not taken anything away from them. I had simply stopped giving them something they no longer valued. The drive home that night felt different from the one after the graduation, not heavier, not lighter, just quieter in a way that no longer needed explanation. I did not replay the conversation in my mind the way I might have before, searching for what I could have said differently or how I could have softened the outcome. There was nothing to adjust. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, and more importantly, everything that needed to be understood had finally been seen for what it was. When I stepped inside my house, I paused for a moment in the doorway, letting the stillness settle around me, and I realized that the silence I used to fear had become something else entirely. It was not emptiness. It was space. Space that did not demand anything from me, space that did not measure my value by what I provided, space that allowed me to simply exist without explanation. The next morning, I woke up without the usual weight of expectation pressing against me, and that alone felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. I made my coffee, sat by the window, and watched the neighborhood move through its routine. People leaving for work, cars passing by, small ordinary moments that reminded me how much of life continues, without needing to be managed or controlled. Around mid-morning my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. It was shorter than usual, stripped of the explanations and justifications he had relied on before. He said they would figure something out for Ethan, that they were looking into loans and other options, and that he hoped we could talk again when things settled down. I read the message carefully, noting what was there and what was not. There was no anger. There was no accusation. But there was also no acknowledgement of what had been said, no recognition of the line that had been crossed. I did not respond right away. Instead, I set the phone down and let the words sit where they belonged, not as something I needed to fix, but as something they would have to carry themselves. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Ethan. His voice was different, quieter, less certain, as if he had stepped into a space he did not fully understand. He asked me if everything was okay, if he had done something wrong, and for a moment I felt the pull of the old instinct, the one that wanted to reassure, to smooth things over, to make sure no one felt uncomfortable. But I did not follow that instinct this time. I told him the truth in the simplest way I could. I told him that none of this was his fault, that his future was still his to build, and that sometimes adults make decisions that have nothing to do with the people caught in the middle. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. He said he never knew how much I had done, that he had always just assumed things were taken care of. I told him that assumption is easy when you are never asked to look beyond it, and that learning to see things clearly is part of growing up. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, not feeling sad, not feeling relieved, just aware of how much had changed in such a short time. In the weeks that followed, I did not reach out the way I once would have. I let the distance remain where it was, not as punishment but as truth. I began to spend my time differently. Meeting Carol for lunch, taking walks in the afternoon, reading books I had set aside for years. Small things, simple things, but they felt like something I had quietly lost and was now finding again. And every now and then I would think back to that moment at the graduation, the words spoken so casually, the way I had sat there and listened, and I would realize something that no longer carried pain, only clarity. They had told me I was not family, and for the first time I had believed them, not as rejection but as understanding. Because family is not built on what you give. It is built on what remains when there is nothing left to take. And now, for the first time in a very long time, I finally knew exactly where I stood.